Welcome to the Invisible India podcast. I'm Jessica.
And I'm Abhishek. We are a cross-cultural couple doing life in India, exploring the lesser-known mysteries of Indian culture,
Interviewing fascinating figures who have chartered new territories, and sharing life as we raise our multicultural family amongst the complexities of modern Indian life. Today, on episode 12, I have with me Jon Rider, founder of HindiUnlocked.com. Today's episode is Learn Hindi Like a Pro. There are dozens of products and courses out there that you can find online, but what really works? What is difficult about learning Hindi? And what do you need to know about learning language as an adult? In today's episode, I'm interviewing Jon Rider, who is a linguist, translator, web developer, cultural trainer, and overall cultural liaison, and founder of HindiUnlocked.com. He's become a friend over the years through our community and commonality of pretty much being total Indophiles, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Jon is one of the only non-Indians who I've met who has become fluent in Hindi as an adult. So now his mission is to help others to learn not only the language, but the cultural underpinnings on which these rapidly changing sociocultural landscapes of the Indian subcontinent hang. His program, Hindi Unlocked, is included in the show notes, and we'll be talking more about that. So, चलिए जॉन जी,
चलिए शुरू किया जाए.
हम थोड़ा हिंदी सीखने के बारे में बातचीत करेंगे.
जरूर.
Thanks so much for taking the time to do the interview.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here with you on the show today.
We're in your home studio, which is pretty awesome. How old is this building, your home here?
The building that we're living in right now, it's on the banks of the river Ganges in Varanasi. And it's about a 300-year-old building.
It's way down in the gullies, so you're really getting the authentic Indian experience staying here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So I'll start just learning about you a little bit, and then we can get into more of the technical details. So tell us about your background, what interested you in India, and how did you get into learning Hindi?
Yeah, great. Well, I decided to take a gap year after high school, and that led me to traveling around a bit. And I found myself in India, and I really just enjoyed the culture. I enjoyed the food. And although I didn't really have much of an interest in language prior to my visit to India, I started to get really interested in language, and in especially the language of Hindi. And that led me to beginning to learn the language myself, to just develop my own system for learning Hindi. And I actually did attend university here in the city as well. I graduated from Banaras Hindu University in linguistics, but I had actually learned Hindi prior to attending university. So yeah, that's a little bit about me, just what I've done and my interest in the language. And I ended up, as you say, you can come to Varanasi, but you can never really leave. And I think that's kind of what happened with me. And I met my wife here, who's Indian, grew up in Varanasi as well, and just settled here and made my life here.
Nice. So how did you actually go through the process of learning Hindi? I met you were in your 20s at that point, so how did you actually go through that process?
Well, I mean, as with anything, you try a few things. You try to find out what works. You get advice from other people who are learning and are doing the same thing. So I tried several programs. I tried, several books, etc. But really, what happened was I kind of created my own system for learning the language. And I think that's what a lot of people end up doing, because as you mentioned earlier, there's so many different learning styles. There's so many different ways to learn a language. And so what I ended up doing was kind of taking the input from some others who were learning and seeing what worked for me, kind of combine that together into a program, into a way of learning.
If I'm wanting to learn Hindi, what should be my goal if I want to become fluent? What does that even look like?
Well, first of all, fluency isn't really a linguistic term. It's more of a popular term used to express the fact that we can communicate on a general range of topics with much ease and be understood.
Nice.
And so I think what we're talking about when we say fluency is we want to be able to easily talk with other people about everyday activities. Because realistically, there are different areas within language. There are different, almost regions, if you will, within language, and you're not going to be fluent in all of those regions. Even in English, you and I, in some of the intellectual spheres or in some of the specific fields, whether that be medicine, whether that be engineering, there are going to be all these words that we don't know, even in English. And it's the same within Hindi. You think you know Hindi, sure, but then you go to a meeting of Ayurvedic doctors in Hindi and then you're totally lost.
Yeah.
So what we're really talking about is general fluency as far as you're able to talk about everyday activities and what you're doing, and you're able to have a conversation with people about life and about basic things. If you want to get into those different spheres of language, whether that be business or whether that be religion or politics or any other sphere, there's got to be a whole new set of vocabulary that you have to learn as well.
Yeah, I hear you. So it's what you're saying is it's highly contextualized. Hindi is a highly contextualized language, and the sets of vocabulary that you need to have, the way that you talk, is going to be different in so many different scenarios and contexts.
Absolutely.
So why do you think so many people are wanting to learn Hindi? It's not Chinese, where there's a clear business purpose behind learning it. It's not like you need to know Hindi to do business in India. You don't necessarily. On the level that you and I are, where we're doing more like social entrepreneurship. But if you're working in a corporate world, you don't need to know Hindi. So what's the advantage of learning Hindi?
I think every language has its own leanings, so to speak. English has become, a language of science, or German is a language of science, and there are other languages that lean towards maybe specific things. And I would say Hindi is really a language of art. It's a language of religion, a language of the heart, and to really connect and have relationships, people at a deep level, to truly, as you said, understand culture, and in the process of learning ourselves, be transformed by that culture. You really have to learn Hindi to appreciate that. There's so much that's been written as far as poetry, art, and especially when you get into understanding and studying Hinduism. If you want to study philosophy, Hindi is a language of philosophy. And I think those of us that are more involved in social endeavors, whether that be, even if it is associated with business, if you do want to interact with society, whether that's from a social work perspective or NGO perspective, really being able to communicate with people in their heart language and connect with them at a deep level just opens up whole new worlds for you.
Totally agree. And to use the name of your own creation here, Hindi is locked within the people. They're not going to open it up so easily. It's not as such an Indian culture is not such an accessible thing. It's not such an accessible world without understanding the languages behind that. And I think that we could go on about colonialism and all that, but I think that the language really is a tool or a doorway to the culture in many ways that might not necessarily be true in other parts of the world, because I would say that many Indian people that I've interacted with that even are fluent in English will only let you so far into their lives unless you really are able to speak their heart language, something that connects with their upbringing, with their culture, with their dharam, with their sanskar, with their parivar, ghar
English is failing her.
English, see, this is it. You're totally getting it. These are the words that don't make sense, and you can't.
Exactly.
There's no words for these things in English,
Exactly.
and if you don't understand that, you don't understand the beauty of Indian culture, and it is really locked within the people themselves. And once you have that key of language, even a little bit of language, people will really start to let you in, and you'll gain so much from learning deeply about the people, about their views. And I really appreciate, John, what you're doing through helping other people, not just to learn the language, but to learn the connecting pieces that help them to learn about Indian culture.
You really can't learn about Indian culture, Hindu culture, outside of the confines of a relationship. I think that's an area where people need to be aware of and need to have some improvement there. One of the biggest challenges for people learning Hindi is to understand the genders, the feminine and the masculine gender.
I see.
And that's where people really struggle. They either obsess about it and it becomes too complex and they just give up and everything's in the masculine, or everything's in the feminine, which is totally wrong. Or
can you give an example of that, so people that might not know Hindi, for example?
So, for example, chai is feminine, and in certain tenses that changes. So, for example, I could say, this is my chai. Even though I'm a man, chai is feminine, so the possessive marker my actually has the feminine ending because it's referring to chai.
Ye meri
Ye
chai
meri
hai.
chai hai.
So instead of ye mera chai hai, like mera would be
The
masculine, it's
ending.
ye meri chai hai. This is my chai. Yeah, I hear you saying.
And in the vocabulary courses that I've done, and I don't have the vocabulary up on Hindi Unlocked yet, you guys can wait for that, but in private classes that I do, when we teach the vocabulary, what I do is I make sure that people learn every new vocabulary word with a marker that agrees with it, whether that marker be an adjective that inflects to the masculine or the feminine ending based on if the object is feminine or masculine.
Right.
So, for example, chai, as we've already said, I wouldn't just teach someone chai means tea. I would say meri chai, meri chai. And then the student knows that chai is actually feminine, and they learn that together. They learn the new vocabulary together with the gender marker.
I see. Or like meeti chai or
Meeti chai,
achi chai.
Achi chai. You could
This
learn
is
any
sweet
of those
tea,
combinations
good tea.
would tell your brain that chai is feminine.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, so specifically as far as what my system would entail or how I would go about learning the language, I tried to divide things into as small bite-sized pieces as possible. A lot of the language programs that are out there today are heavily focused on building vocabulary and learning vocabulary. Yeah. And that's great. You need vocabulary. You need to build vocabulary. But actually, initially, the system that I was using and the program that I was a part of focused so heavily on vocabulary that they said don't learn grammar for the first 3 months. And, I'm a rule breaker, so of course I bent the rules and broke the rules with that program because I felt like grammar is so important. It's not something that we should be afraid of. So often, people hear grammar, they're afraid of grammar. Yeah. But actually, if you think about it, grammar gives us the rules. It gives us keys by which we can unlock language. And that's where I got the idea for my website, Hindi Unlocked. So a lot of those keys, for example, we think about a tense. How do you say something in a tense? How do you say I do something on a regular basis? I give you those rules, and then you can apply those rules in any context with any verb. So I can give you a basic rule. I can teach you one or two pronouns, and then I can say you can take any verb and you can use this exact structure to apply that verb and to use that verb in this specific tense. And so if you think about this mathematically, I teach you one structure. You have this pronoun, it takes this ending, and you can take any verb that I give you, and literally with one rule, now you can say thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of things.
Based on the gaps of the current language tools in the market, you feel like grammar is one of the missing pieces, and an accessible way of grammar, not like a rote memorization kind of grammar. So using these tools to help people figure out for themselves how to speak Hindi. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at any of the major products out there, whether that be Rosetta Stone, whether that be Duolingo, or any of these. They're heavily centered on vocabulary, and they're operating off the assumption that you should learn language as a child learns, as a baby learns. Why should you learn language as a baby? You're an adult. You already learned language as a baby. You can understand these basic grammatical rules, and you can apply them instantly. These programs leave your brain to figure out the grammar rules somehow magically by yourself. Why? Because maybe people are afraid of grammar. They don't want to bog you down with grammar. But we have to realize grammar isn't something that bogs you down, but it's something that gives you the keys that really unlock the language and unlock the ability to be able to say something in many different ways.
I feel like I also did one of these programs that encourages you to delay the grammar portion and encourages you to learn like a child. And it worked for me, but it is very disorienting to your brain. I wish I could go back and redo some of the ways that I had learned, because I think there are some gaps in that exist in the marketplace, especially for Hindi products. And almost is like your brain, that part of your brain, when you're learning in that way of just learning vocabulary and point and listen, your brain gets very jumbled. And I don't know if there is a way to avoid that when you're language learning.
My rule of thumb would be learn less and practice more. And that's where the concept of drilling comes into language learning. Grammar is important, but at the same time, to solidify it in our minds and to make it natural to produce, we spend a lot of time drilling. And that's part of our model as well. You know, I was just thinking, what if we just, for the sake of argument, had a little experiment here, just took some time to demo for you what this actually looks like.
Yeah.
In Hindi, the pronoun for I is main. Now, main begins a sentence, and we have to use the helping verb with main the majority of the time. So the helping verb for main is whom. Main whom. I am. Okay? I am. Verbs in Hindi always end with the na. N-A. Na. The first thing that we want to do to any verb in Hindi is take off the N-A. So you remove the na and you're left with the root of a word. For example, ana means to come. Now, before we use that verb, we're going to drop the NA, leaving us with ah. Now we have the root of our verb, and we can plug it in and use it to do anything we want. So, for example, going back to मैं हूँ, I am, add the appropriate ending for the present habitual tense. Okay, if I'm using big terminology, don't worry about that. If you're a man, add ta to the end of our verb root. So a becomes ata. If you're a female, add t to the end of the verb root, and a becomes ati. Now we have to sandwich that in between our pronoun and our helping verb. मैं आता हूँ, I come. And if you're a female, you would say मैं आती हूँ. So it sounds a little bit complicated, but if you see it on paper, if you see it in the videos, it's very clear, it's very simple. Now you've learned not only a phrase, I come, but you've learned the structure of the language. And I can give you any other verb. For example, I can give you the verb jana. You know you have to take off the na. That leaves you with ja. Jana means to go, okay? You know you have to take off the na. That leaves you with ja. And then you follow the structure. You add ta if you're a male. You add t if you're a female. मैं जाता हूँ, I go if I'm a male. मैं जाती हूँ, I go if I'm a female. I can give you any one of 1,000 verbs, and you already know how to speak. And that's just the basic thing. From there, we layer on more complexity. We teach you how to add question words. Do you go? Mm-hmm. We teach you how to change the tense. Are you going? Will you go? Then we add more pronouns. We are going. We go. Are we going? And we add complexity in that way. So I would say it's a layered approach, and there is a lot of practice. For each grammar lesson that I have drill sheets that accompany that. Nice. So it's actually in the English and in the Hindi. You walk through the drill sheets and you practice. I am going. Mm-hmm. You are going. We are going. Are you going? Are we going? Mm-hmm. And it really gets your brain to the point where it kind of sucks in the deep structure of the language and gets you learning fast. So that's my advice: is learn less and practice more.
That's really good. So this is almost like a programmer's approach to learning language, of plugging in the HTML between the brackets. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I am a coder as well. And it is, I mean, I would call it an algorithmic system for learning languages. Mm-hmm. And I do have flowcharts in my videos as well. So what it's maybe hard to picture what I've mentioned in the audio setting. But if you look at the videos, it's all visual. I've got flowcharts and stuff. I actually was invited to the All India Institute of Linguistics. You can look up my paper. I presented a paper on presenting, teaching language to foreigners using visual representation. Awesome. So this is really visual. It's a way to visualize and conceptualize how the language works.
That's awesome. So I want to ask some questions about just Hindi in general, and so you've obviously identified a gap that you see of a systematic, organized, visualized approach to learning Hindi. So that's a gap that
yes.
you see. Are there any other gaps that you think are there of why it's so difficult to learn Hindi?
One of the gaps also is in learning the script, which is Devanagari, the Devanagari script. So often, again, adult students are taught as children would be taught in schools. Basically, you memorize the ABCs. Memorizing the ABCs does not really help you read Hindi. What I do instead is, if some of our listeners are familiar with phonics, it's more similar to a phonics type system where I teach you one consonant, then I teach you one vowel sound, and then maybe I teach you another consonant. We take those together and make our first word. Then we rearrange the consonants and we create another word. Then maybe I'll introduce another consonant, another vowel. But what I've done is you start reading from the very beginning.
I see.
You're not spending hours and hours and hours memorizing some chart where maybe you can produce the sounds, but still you cannot put those sounds together and actually read. So from the very beginning, it's again that layered approach. Introduce a consonant, we introduce another vowel, we introduce another consonant, and only later do we get to more the difficult aspects of the script where you have what are called conjuncts, two consonants together. But from the very beginning, you're reading Hindi. Yeah. You're reading the Devanagari script.
Which I feel like is super important because I would say one of the most important and neglected parts of learning Hindi, if you're not a native speaker or you're not in this environment, is the pronunciation.
Absolutely. And the script helps you to be able to pronounce words correctly. Because what often happens in language programs, the students are encouraged not to learn the script.
Right.
And therefore, they're writing words in Roman, in English lettering, and they're getting the pronunciation wrong. Well, why is that? Because they haven't been introduced to the actual phonemes, the sounds in the language that don't exist in English or don't exist in their mother tongue. So they're not able to distinguish those differences, and as a result, their pronunciation is off.
Yeah, and the pronunciation, I feel like, is one of almost the unforgivables of Hindi when you're talking with a native speaker, because you can have great vocabulary, but if you can't pronounce it, people are not going to understand you.
Right.
And that's a big issue, I feel, that's in the current systems out there is, how do you really learn how to pronounce things, and taking it from that transliterated perspective to actually retraining your brain to say, no, you need to make a completely different sound. It's not, ka is not KH.
Yes.
Right? There's no sound like that in American English that we can replicate. You actually have to learn, the na, the dha, these are the important sounds that we have to learn, and you can have the best vocabulary. And I would say people can be a bit unforgiving when it comes to pronunciation. If you have very simple vocabulary but you pronounce it well, people will be more likely to say, "Wow, uski Hindi kitni achhi hai." Well, kitne fluently bolte hain, kitne अच्छी बोलती है, कितना अच्छी बोलते हैं. But if you have lousy pronunciation and you have all these fantastic vocabulary, people are like, वो Hindi सीख रहा है बेचारा,
That's correct. That's right. Absolutely. So I think learning the script is important, and I would advise people actually begin there. And people say, should I really waste my time learning script before I even learn the vocabulary? I would say yes, because that is, in the long run, that is going to benefit you highly as far as your pronunciation, and being able to read Hindi is important if you're going to do any amount of work in India, or if you want to live here or even visit for a while. I would highly recommend that you learn the script. And we have, of course, the script videos, the course. You can check out Beginner Hindi Script on HindiUnlocked.com.
Super.
To start there.
So this sounds like a great way to get people started, to get people going, to get people to understand the basics. So how do you take people from the basics into fluency? Because I feel like there's a lot of people get stuck in the basics. I understand a little bit, I can say a few things, but how do you take them to that next level? And what are the places that people get stuck?
I think people get stuck probably in the classroom. The classroom is important, it's necessary, whether that be classes that you're taking, whether it's my online classes, the classroom itself isn't enough. And at some point, whether that's at the beginning, in the beginning stages of your learning journey or towards the middle, the most important thing is immersion, language immersion. So that's being in the environment of the language, being surrounded by people who speak the language more than anything, maybe even more than the course that I created. Me living actually in India, living in Varanasi, living with an Indian family, spending probably 40 hours a week immersed totally in the language did more than anything to help me learn quickly, rapidly.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people are missing out.
Yeah.
That's where the gap comes in. People think they can just learn from books. People
Right.
think they can just learn in a class. You can't. You cannot become fluent unless you're immersed in the language, unless you're building friendships and relationships in that language. I think that's probably the missing piece.
I agree with you completely. I feel that, especially Americans, we want to hack everything.
Yeah.
And, you know, we try to hack language.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work that way. You know, we can understand the language through tools like your tool, but becoming fluent, becoming familiar with the language actually changes part of you in a sense, if you're really learning it. And language is about people. Language is a tool of communication that furthers relationships. It's not a tool in our career toolbox or something that we can write on our resume to get us a better job. And I would say for people who live outside of India that don't necessarily have a huge community of Hindi speakers, or I would say this can apply for any Indian language in most cases, how do you find that immersive experience? What would you recommend for people who don't have access to Hindi speakers in every area of their life?
I mean, with the Indian diaspora being all over the world, it's hard to find even a medium to small town where there isn't an Indian community.
Yeah.
But I would suggest that people spend a lot of time watching Bollywood movies, listening to music, Hindi music. I probably watched one Bollywood movie a week when I was learning Hindi. And that can definitely go a long way to providing a more immersive experience. There are a lot of apps and stuff online as well. I don't remember the names of them off the top of my head, but there's one in particular that you can actually look for pen pals, so to speak. It's a messaging app who speak a specific language and who want to learn your language.
Wow.
That's a really cool tool. You can send audio messages, you can send text messages. You know what we'll do? We'll look it up and we'll put it in the show notes for you later.
Because that's really great. It's about that personal communication in that sense. You're learning from a person. You're not learning from a book. And you and I both know very well that the Hindi that exists now is not even the same Hindi that existed 15 years ago when you and I were in our beginning of our Hindi learning journey.
Right.
It is regional. It's you have to change the way you speak according to age, where you're at, the status of the person you're speaking with, their age, your age, if they're more respected than you, if they're a child, if they're your employer, if you're their employer. I mean, these are all things that a book will not teach you. And that personal connection of understanding who you're talking to, in what context, is so crucial. What do you think is one of the most unknown or locked up, misunderstood things about Indian culture that learning Hindi would help someone to understand?
I think one of the most profound things, or the most challenging things to understand is family, and the expectations of family.
Yeah.
How strong the family unit is in India Jessica and I share something in common. We are both married to Indians. I thought I knew a lot about the culture. I thought I knew a lot about India, and then I married an Indian woman, and I discovered that I had a lot to learn.
Yes, I can relate to that.
Yeah. And I think knowing the language definitely positioned me to be able to understand and to comprehend the importance of family and what family is. And the expectations that are there within the family unit that differ so much. And seeing that from the outside, even as a Hindi speaker, I couldn't really comprehend that until I entered into the context of, a marriage to an Indian woman and saw the process and became a son-in-law. Mm-hmm. They call me India ka damad. So I'm the son-in-law of all of India.
Jon Rider, India ka damad.
So, yeah, I think more than anything, Hindi would prepare you to understand and to experience that. Even the relational words, we don't have words to say, like our paternal uncle or, maternal uncle or all these different things. Yes. Or whether is this my grandmother who's my mom's mom or my grandmother who's my dad's mom? Is it nani or dadi? But with Hindi, we have access to those terms within very simple words.
They mean very different things, and they have very different expectations of how you relate to them. Right.
So absolutely, family.
That's a great answer, and that's a great closing comment of why Hindi does really need to be unlocked in many ways. So thank you so much. So Jon is giving a deal for anyone that's listening to this episode on HindiUnlock.com. If you use the code InvisibleIndia, and that's one word, InvisibleIndia, you get a 25% discount on any of his courses. So that's a sweet deal, and I've peeked at some of his stuff and really solid. It's really helpful. You have stuff for beginners. You have stuff for intermediate.
Working on stuff for intermediate.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. And just knowing Jon and his depth of understanding of the language and culture, he's not new to teaching people about Hindi. This is something that he's been doing for a long 10 plus years. You've been helping others to learn. This is solid material. So if you're interested in learning Hindi, obviously this is why I'm doing a podcast with Jon, because I want to highlight what he's doing, and I think it'll help a lot of people. So if people want to find you, Jon, where else can they find you? Primarily your website is the best place to contact you.
You can look on our website. We are on, of course, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. You can search for Hindi Unlocked.
Super. Yeah. Awesome. So leave your comments for us on any of our social media platforms, on the podcast. Thanks again, Jon, for spending this time with us. It's awesome.
You're welcome.